Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of our CTLP Teaching and Learning webinar. My name is Vinay. I'll be the host and moderator for today. I'm from the Center for Teaching and Learning Pedagogy under Inspire, but most of the heavy lifting and hard work for the webinar really is done by my colleague Yun Yi at CTLP. Today, we have an interesting topic, opportunities and challenges for STEM education in the age of the fourth industrial revolution and artificial intelligence by Dr. Bryan Penprase, um, who has some history in Singapore, and I hope he'll be kind enough to share with us what he's done in Singapore. He used to live in Singapore at one point. I will leave some of this. Before we talk a bit more about Bryan, let me just make some housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be shared after the webinar on our YouTube, the Inspire NTU YouTube channel, which has a playlist for CTLP webinars. If you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A segment, you can use the raise hand function, or you can type any comments or questions that you might have in the chat during or after the webinar. Plug for the Inspire social media channel. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in the world of higher education pedagogy within and beyond NTU, you can follow, scan the QR code and check out what's going on there. Okay, this Uni will pop this in the chat, I think, at some point. You can we welcome your feedback and to see how we might improve the future versions of this. So do feel free to leave your feedback with us. Today, I'm very, very thankful that we have Dr. Bryan Penprase with us. He's the Vice President for Sponsored Research and External Academic Relations. He's also a Professor of Physics and Astronomy from the SoCal University of America. And as I mentioned, Bryan is both an internationally renowned physicist as well as a STEM educator and a higher education researcher and scholar. So we're kind of very fortunate to have him with us today. It's very late in the evening over there in California. So I'm also thankful that he's taken the time to spend with us as well. So as I mentioned, Bryan has spent some time in Singapore with Yale and US. I'm going to hand over the time to you, Bryan. I wonder if you maybe want to begin by telling us a little bit about what you've done, or at some point share with us what you've done in Singapore. So I'll stop sharing and pass the time over to Bryan Penprase.
Unmute. It's really great to be with you all, and thanks, Vinay, for the opportunity to be virtually in Singapore again. I do miss a lot of things about Singapore. I lived there for 3 years with my daughter, my wife, and our two dogs over at NUS, and it was a wonderful adventure being part of the group that started up what used to be called Yale NUS College and now is called NUS College. And in that role, I was able to work a lot with NUS and its Center for Development of Teaching and Learning, go to some amazing talks at NUS. And this is actually when I first encountered the ideas of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, because they had a World Economic Forum meeting as part of the APRU, which is a group that NTU also belongs to. And it was a really wonderful framing, I thought, for the age that we are in right now. At those years, I was there from around 2013 to 2017. It was still kind of on the cusp of happening. It seemed a bit futuristic, but I think now pretty much everyone would agree that we're right in the middle of at least the AI part of the fourth industrial revolution. So I'm going to be talking today about how that substantially and completely transforms what we're doing, both in our research and our teaching, and how we as educators have a debt to our students and to our societies to retool our teaching practice and really fully embrace many of these technologies, and more importantly, what they mean for how we teach and how we learn. So I'll go into the talk now in the full screen mode. And Vinay, let me know if there's any technical issues. Okay, so yeah, I work at Soka University of America, which is a small liberal arts
Bryan, I think
institution.
we lost your slides again once you clicked play.
Okay,
Sorry for
I'll go
that.
back and I will share. Let me go back to the beginning here of this, and I will say share, and I will go to my window, and I'll go here, and I'll keep it in this mode then. Sorry
All
about
right.
that.
Yeah, no worries, no
Okay,
worries.
so the basic thought is I started and ran a teaching and learning center in Singapore for our faculty at the Yale and US College and worked with the CDTL. And I also did a lot of work in the US on this teaching and learning area. And one thing I've learned from, over a decade of being at the, center of these teaching and learning centers, oftentimes the people who come are the ones who need it least. So I'm really grateful that all of you are out there, and I'm sure we'll all learn from each other. And having a sort of collaborative community talking about teaching is the first step for everyone to improve. I also know that for faculty who are maybe either too busy or skeptical to come to such events or centers, they can actually, I think now, benefit from intensive training in how to teach in this new age of AI that will benefit not only their teaching but their research. So there's now really very much a dual use to these ideas. So let me jump in and just give a quick refresher for the fourth industrial revolution idea. This involves the idea that there are different stages in economic history where a technology utterly transforms society, and then all manner of different things are irrevocably changed due to this technology. So the first obvious one is the Industrial Revolution, which brought about manufacturing, which changed how urban centers were designed, changed education, any number of other things. Electricity opening up nighttime activities to people, allowing things like electric elevators and any number of other conveniences. And then in our younger years, we have experienced the third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, where everything went online and it utterly transformed how businesses, governments, everything we do is done. So now this is the fourth one, and the fourth one is actually different from all the previous ones in that these are the various technologies that are not only happening all at once, but they are what are sometimes called exponential technologies. So as we've seen with the third industrial revolution in computing, the Moore's law, which produced doublings in terms of power and halving in terms of cost, resulted in geometric increases of performance and similar reductions in cost. So that exponential rate of progress is now happening with artificial intelligence and many other fields. And sometimes the basket of fields changes a bit, but I think everyone agrees that AI is certainly in the forefront right now. And AI, as it combines with biotech, as it combines with robotics, as it combines with nanotechnology, and as it becomes turbocharged with quantum computing, will become amazingly powerful in ways that are even hard to imagine. This also means that the whole palette of disciplines that you might consider in your course, in your teaching, in your departments become connected in all kinds of different ways. And this is a website from the World Economic Forum that presents all the different facets of how the fourth industrial revolution is transforming all the little topics that may be hard to read, but on the outside, everything from migration, from digital identity, from cybersecurity, all these different components are all changing rapidly. And the website, and I put all these links on the slides, which I think we'll distribute afterwards. It's really fun to look at because you can pick on any one of the technologies, such as AI, and it points you to any number of different works that are in subfields of AI. So I use this just to point out that the canon and the very structure of disciplines is now being rewritten, and they're being rewritten in a way that makes them interconnected and impossible to detangle. So if you have a very narrow disciplinary expertise, it becomes more and more difficult to A, stay current, and B, contribute without running ahead with the latest models, the latest technologies. And it becomes a really difficult challenge to maintain your edge if you are thinking that your edge comes from a static basis of knowledge or content. And so this really puts the mandate to shift away from content-oriented teaching into this more process-based teaching. I'll talk about that in a second. I wrote a piece as part of a book out when I was out in Singapore that this book is actually quite nice and it's available through open publishing. And it contains all kinds of different chapters about how the fourth industrial revolution will impact us in education. I would like to think that STEM education in the fourth industrial revolution needs to take a new shape, just as our factories, which is shown here, this rusting factory, need to be replaced with something new. And in this revolution, we have to then account for this convergence or fusion of these different technologies and their exponential growth. And so because this will fundamentally reshape our society, we as educators need to respond and update and train our students to be capable in this new society. The different technologies, as I mentioned, are all changing rapidly. And what this means then is that for us to readapt the STEM curriculum for this means that we have to then take our disciplinary knowledge and expand it into a more current version that incorporates interdisciplinary perspectives and really makes full use of the emerging technologies. And what it also means is that students, as they approach these technologies, are not going to be served by having any sort of static set of facts because those facts are changing so fast. There are, of course, some fundamental ideas. They definitely need those, but they really also need to have the adaptability, which we ourselves are trying to develop. And so as a group, students, faculty, staff, we're all in it together. And so this wave of change allows us the opportunity to find new ways to teach that are more collaborative and that really do focus on this sort of adaptability. So in this way, then, if we have new teaching approaches that make use of the technology from the last industrial revolution, blended instruction, using online courses, some materials from AI, and integrating that into what we do, we can then move into more multidisciplinary teaching. And we can also move into a mode where we're cultivating creative thinking and higher order learning in our students. So this is also happening as our fields and our courses are changing. Our institutions are also changing. And in Singapore and other nations, there's a greater and greater emphasis on continuous learning. And there's also around the world an emphasis on micro-credentials, which I've been working actually with APRU on to try to get the APRU universities to work together to create new micro-credentials. All of these challenges are things that we as a community of educators have to work on together. And so it's great to have this center and this series to help us all think about this as a community. So the bottom line here is that in this era of the fourth industrial revolution, we need to update our curriculum, find new teaching approaches, and move away from what is sometimes called crystallized knowledge. And in this shift, we as researchers and teachers are necessarily needing to update skills and cultivate in ourselves and our students what is sometimes called fluid intelligence. Again, this adaptability, capability to quickly pivot and use these new technologies. And on this, I was talking with a faculty member from a new university in the Emirates. It's called the Mohammed bin Zayed Artificial Intelligence University. And you could imagine that if you're teaching artificial intelligence, what you know is actually going to be out of date in a few months. So dealing with that challenge requires you to remain current, and it puts a premium on the judgment. As a faculty member, you have other skills, wisdom, judgment, instincts, and what Carl Wieman, which I'll talk about in a second, calls expert thinking. And really thinking about those skills and bringing them into the front of your course design is, I think, one of the main opportunities of this time that we're in, this fourth industrial revolution. So I'm going to pause right here and I'm going to see if there are questions, comments, reflections out there. And Vinay's going to help me also. If you put questions in the chat, that's probably the best way.
Yeah, so if you want to put any questions in the chat or in the Q&A thing, I can try and scour them to see if there's any that we can pick up, Brian. So I think I also didn't inform everyone that we might periodically stop during the course of this webinar to pause for questions. So that's my bad. But if you think of anything, like feel free to pop it in.
Yeah. And
If
Vinay, you can
nothing
stop me
is,
too. If a question comes up, I'm happy to pause and take that question.
I think.
If there are none, I can go right back into my talk, but let me know if there are any.
So we have a question from Vahid. Thank you. Could you please elaborate on the micro-credential program that you mentioned? I think this is the APRU thing,
Yeah,
if I'm not
APRU.
wrong. Yeah,
Yeah. So
you
I've been
know,
working, I'm part of a group of people from the APRU, which is 62 universities around the world, Pacific-oriented universities. NTU and NUS are both members, and I'm part of their University of the Future committee. We're actually meeting tomorrow. And as part of that work, I wrote a very extensive white paper on micro-credentials. And around the world, there are different frameworks for establishing standards for micro-credentials. And around the world, there are different universities that have, to various degrees, incorporated micro-credentials into their academic programs. And these are a burgeoning sector of education offered by top technology firms around the world. The students are taking them. And it's really an opportunity for us as university educators to connect with our colleagues in industry. And by bringing both sides to the table, it's possible to create better micro-credentials that are more aligned with our coursework and to then also enable our faculty to benefit from the very current and very job-ready kinds of skills that these micro-credentials offer. So as part of that effort, we're talking as a group about how we can adopt some common standards and work to agree on ways that micro-credentials might be shared within the universities. So that's that topic.
So I hope that answers the question, Vahid. I also kind of have a bit of a follow-up, if that's okay, Brian.
Sure thing.
Uh,
Yeah.
so I'm just curious. I think part of the idea there is also to maybe encourage some form of lifelong learning, or maybe
Yeah.
more kind of purpose fit, kind of fit for purpose kind of learning. I just wonder if this also signals the beginning of a move away from the 4-year degree.
Mhm.
Is there any discussion around that? Are we moving towards a more lifelong oriented degree type
Yeah.
situation? Yeah.
Well, I did flip past that slide a little bit, but the Stanford had, as part of their D school, what was called the Stanford 2025 program. And in their design effort, which was done about 10 years ago, they identified what they called the open loop university as a concept that might arise in the coming years. It's one where you don't get all of your learning in one 4-year dose, but instead you might take 1 or 2 years, go off into the industry and come back. And in that way, you're sharing your experience with your fellow students and then also updating your skills. And I think regardless of whether universities are changing their curriculum, this way of allowing workers and older adults to benefit from our universities is essential because, as I was saying, the pace of change is so rapid that they need to upskill, reskill, and retrain. And so, really having a channel for doing that and thinking creatively about what opportunities that provides is a really great thing for us to be doing. So, this will bring more students into our campuses, but also kind of a broader array of life experiences that will really deepen the experience in classrooms for our younger students. So I think this is, again, both the challenge and the opportunity, but it's definitely going to be more and more a part of the landscape in all of our universities.
No, I see. I see. Very, very interesting. Can I invite further questions? If there's nothing much at this point, we can also move on and come back and we
Okay,
can stop again later.
go back. Yeah, so
Yeah, I
one
don't see
thing,
anything in the chat at the moment, so maybe we can move ahead first.
cool. Yeah, and I'm trying as best I can to create something like an active learning environment here, but it's very, very hard on Teams. Um,
Oh yeah,
I think we'll
sorry
see in
about
this
that.
next part, that's a really important thing. So I'm going to go here and next talk about, can you see the slides okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to, at this point, talk about another way of thinking about teaching, which I think is very productive. And I think it gives us leverage and a footing and a set of a confidence that often isn't in place when people begin their teaching careers. And one ironic thing about teaching at university, there's not usually a lot of training. You're just thrown out there and expected to do it. And so being able to identify some of the key principles of how people learn and what is effective teaching is essential. And thankfully, it's easier than ever to do. So one of my heroes in this area is Carl Wieman, who is a physicist. I'm a physics astronomy guy myself, and he spent his career working to get the Nobel Prize, which he did in 2001, and realized after he got his prize that a lot of what he saw at the best universities around the world and how physics was taught was seriously broken. And he's identified some key assumptions that are wrong in most classrooms and some new ideas that can replace those assumptions that will then create, with almost 100% confidence, an improvement in your ability to have your students learn. So one of his more recent publications on this comes from this book, which again is free, available online. And he wrote a piece called Expertise in University Teaching and Implications for Teaching Effectiveness. And this, to summarize some of the findings from his work, he relies on the fact that real, real knowledge requires one to go beyond factual recall and even factual transfer, but to go into a deeper mode, which he calls expert thinking, in which you can then really be effective in an authentic context. So he believes that you have to think very carefully about what you're asking your students to do, but really it is what the students do that matters more than anything. So shifting into this idea that it's a student-centered type of teaching focused on, again, authentic kinds of problems, and then working with the students to then cultivate those skills they need. And this is also aligned with this idea of the fourth industrial revolution teaching paradigm, which is that as the knowledge changes faster and faster, what we really need to focus on is developing skills for updating our knowledge and our students' knowledge, and then integrating that with our past knowledge and then allowing it to then work on the rapidly changing domains that we're all experts in. But in his case, too, he noticed that research in learning science and in education over the sort of course of the last part of the 20th century, early 21st century, had produced a whole variety of what we can call research validated techniques, which just like in medicine, when we moved away from, folk remedies, these research validated techniques have been proven to work. And so it really shifts what we do in the classroom into a much firmer footing. And so he likens it to this transition in medicine where an individual folk art was then transformed into something that has proven and validated practices. And I think if you really think about how most faculty start teaching, it really is a folk art. Like they might have some personal myths from their youth about what was really effective teaching based on their own experience. They might have some prized and cherished ideas that they have from themselves. And I'm guilty of this. I've done all of this. But then there's really not a mechanism for broadening that set of experiences and testing it and validating it. So going outside of your own experience and benefiting from all this research is crucial. And what's nice is that you can then use this expertise that you have in your discipline and then help your students also work with you to develop judgment. So in his mind, expertise is one that is the ability to make quality decisions in novel contexts. And this is something that he promotes in his course design and in his teaching. So anyway, so we've got the medical analogy, so we can move forward with research validated techniques. All right, so what are they? Well, these things, I've got to switch forward a little bit, have arisen in the last many decades using discipline-based education research. And there are a couple of fundamental principles that involve studying brain science and the way that people learn. And there's two main things that he believes are essential. One is you have to have a certain amount of practice at expert level decision making with feedback. So that's different from just drills of rote kind of calculations. But it is the idea of repeated exercises that put students in situations that are aligned well with the actual field and then in real time giving them feedback. So this is how he believes that expert thinking can be cultivated. And this arises from what he calls discipline-based education research, which you don't have to read all of it. You can just benefit from the results. But the idea is that the brain will learn based on this practice and feedback. And he has written about this and demonstrated it at three major universities where he was based, where he set up science education initiatives. Okay, so these are the main components then that you need for effective learning. You need to, of course, have the expertise to bring in the right kinds of activities. So this is where your role is not so much to create a menu of facts and ideas to memorize, but instead to decide how your expertise can be put into practice and to emulate the thinking of experts in their field. And then along with that comes the idea that anyone can learn this subject, the idea of the growth mindset, which ironically is also a big problem for a lot of new teachers. Some people imagine that either you're a good teacher or you aren't. And I will say right here, just like in learning your discipline, if you have the right attitude, this growth mindset, that you can learn just through hard work, effort, and discipline, then you'll get better. And you can practice that in your teaching and learn that you can teach better. And you can also have your students learn that. The idea of prior knowledge is super important. So here we're actually, it's a reprise of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and other thinkers from long ago. But you really do need to think carefully about where students are and what they already know, meaning that they had some prior education that either gives them a useful foundation for your subject or gives them a whole lot of misconceptions and wrong ideas. And you need to account for that in your teaching. And then this last one here, brain constraints, is crucial. This is something that almost all new faculty, and I was one of them, do wrong. You start and you want to deliver the best lecture in the world, and you put 20 pages of beautiful lecture notes out there. And unfortunately, your students pretty much run out of gas after 5 or 7 new ideas. And other educational research has shown attention spans, especially from today's generation, fall off nearly exponentially after about 6 minutes of lecturing. So you need to account for that and how you approach this, because otherwise you're talking essentially to an empty room. The other two things that are super important, when you have students do things in the classroom or for assignments, you need to always be sure that they're doing things that emulate expert thinking and that produce an actual useful product. And in this way, you can provide a basis for feedback that, again, replicates some of the practices and standards in your field. The other part that is crucial to the active learning environment is to leverage the ways in which students interact with each other as a means for promoting learning. And it's been found through multiple studies over decades that this process of interaction and verbally describing ideas and explaining to each other is crucial for promoting learning in the classroom. And most people know this, but the active learning pedagogy can sometimes be very chaotic and difficult to implement. And it requires a conscious effort to explain this to the students as well, who may not be as familiar with it. But research tells you that it is actually quite effective. And there are a lot of studies I could point to. Some of them are in my book that validate these techniques. So, all right, so we're going to want to have lots of opportunities for students not just to do simple rote kind of tasks, but tasks that involve decision making. They're going to need feedback, they're going to need authentic context, and they're going to actually have a necessary practice so that they can develop something like the Malcolm Gladwell idea, the 10,000 hours. In this case, he's saying 50 hours. So this is the idea that we want to try to implement. And the idea then will allow us to transform our teaching not from an individual kind of bespoke craft, but instead just becoming part of a larger research community that has done enough work to assure you success. And it's actually a wonderful thing to benefit by just using these research-based teaching practices. There's no longer a dispute that the active learning and these kind of peer learning techniques are more effective. And they're actually quite enjoyable to implement once you get used to it, have a little bit of practice, and then notice how well the students are learning. Okay, so this is where I pause again to see if there are questions.
Yep. So any questions from the audience?
I think it's important when you're giving a teaching talk to practice what you preach to some extent. So
Yeah, always a little bit harder on new
it's
technology than
definitely on Zoom, but if we were in person, we'd definitely do the table exercise where people would talk, they'd find examples, they'd report out, they'd get to know each other. And this socially mediated learning is crucial for students, especially, and for adults. When I started this process of learning active learning as an introvert, which I know many faculty in science are, I found it kind of intimidating when we were being asked to interact with all these random people. And I think that's a component that we need to account for that and I found when I was teaching in Singapore as well, a lot of students were very uncomfortable with these kinds of techniques. And there are modifications you can make. So instead of having students all talking to each other or talking to the class, you can structure it in different ways so that they can be thinking individually and writing something and maybe sharing a writing with each other or maybe having a way of creating these minute essays in class. Those are things that I found worked really well with a more shy group of students. You can also then circulate in a class, and instead of having them talk to the whole room, just have small conversations with one table at a time. I found that's also less intimidating for some of the more shy students. Any questions, Vinay?
yes, I have a question from the chat. My esteemed colleague Lim Lin asks, "Hi there, thanks for your talk. In your view, what counts as quote unquote evidence? Is it mostly experimental research? What about the role of values in deciding quote unquote what works?" So,
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so interesting that we as practitioners in STEM fields rely solely on data in our research. And we have standards and we have ways of proving effectiveness. And it's very hard for us to have that same confidence about educational research. A lot of it may be done in other contexts that are not relevant to us. They may be done by people who don't even know our discipline. And so I think this is where the DBER idea that Carl Wieman talks about, the discipline-based educational research, is super important. And for me as a physicist, my whole story, which I tell in my book on STEM education, it involved the journey of the physics community, which started with the force concept inventory, which was a small little test that involved asking students really good questions about mechanics. Two things are colliding, which one moves faster? Really basic but important questions that really probed whether students understood the fundamental concepts. And they deployed these tests to hundreds of physics classrooms around the country over decades, and then saw how students performed in either an active learning environment or a non-active learning environment. And they were able to document doublings of test scores in the active learning environments. And there are many, many other examples like this in other disciplines. So I guess what I would say is look into your disciplinary community. Oftentimes at your scientific meetings, they'll have educational sessions and just sort of see what they're saying in your specific discipline. And as I have seen in all across all the different disciplines, these techniques have been validated and proven with these kinds of controlled studies, but with variations. And there's a lot of different changes that come as you translate from one discipline to another. So that's a long answer, but it's not like one size fits all, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Thanks. I actually have some follow-up questions on that, but there's another question in the chat from one Edward Lau from, I think, the Civil and Environmental Engineering School, but I'm not sure. Thanks. Do you observe the difference when interacting with full-time students versus adult mid-career learners? So,
Yeah,
very
that's a great
timely
question.
question here.
Yeah, so here you have an opportunity if you have these adult learners to give students not only an authentic context for the discipline you're imparting, but a more authentic context for what they'll find outside of the university. So if you're at a team at work, you're going to be mixed in with people that could be 20 years older than you or 10 years younger. And so establishing comfort and skills for communicating across disciplines is super important. I've certainly found that the older students are maybe less shy about asking questions and maybe more confident than they should be in certain cases. But they also, what I found when I've had them in my classroom, the older students are really grateful to have the opportunity to learn. And their life experience, because they've had decades out there in the real world, provides a really important dimension to a classroom. And especially in rapidly changing fields, integrating in what you might call field practitioners into your classroom in the form of guest lecturers or other visitors can really be a great way to get students to the forefront of that skill and also update your own skills. So I've had a lot of good luck with that, bringing in top astrophysicists into my astronomy class, and it's also been great for me to learn from.
Great. I have another question that is starting to pour in now from Daisy. Thank you, Brian, for your insightful talk. For social learning, I have a feeling that AI is impacting as our learners turn to AI before their peers. How to
Yeah,
balance the use of AI in social learning? Thank you.
that's a great question also. And it's funny because I was talking to these guys from the MBZ UAI, this AI university, and I asked them the question. I said, well, why do you even need a university? You've got all these brilliant kids. Why don't they just work with the AIs and not even get in one room together? And so the answer that I got back from them was that actually it's true that you can do a lot with the AI, but those higher order skills, which is actually what I'm going to talk about next, of discerning differences of opinion, different kinds of answers, and finding the judgment to select the correct one among many are all things that you can only do with another human and dealing with the idea that another person might have a different opinion and finding common ground with them is going to become an ever more important skill. And as students become more and more reliant on AI, a more necessary kind of training. So you can use the AI to get a certain distance, but it's that kind of integrative part and bringing different ideas to different people together that becomes what's super important in the classroom. So it's something like a flipped classroom if you think about it. In the old days of flipped classrooms, right, we'd create a video, they'd watch it, they'd come in and do problems. And now you can imagine them playing around with the AIs, but then bringing the output of the AI and not using the AI to figure it out, but using their colleagues to figure out how best to interpret what it's saying, how best to integrate it with other contexts, and how to go beyond and add value to what the AI does. So rather than sort of forbidding the AI because in their regular lives and in their careers they'll need it, figure out ways to extend it and to use it as a tool for cultivating critical thinking, I think is super, another one of those opportunities and also challenges.
All right. I think we okay, there's no more questions in the chat
Okay,
for now.
cool.
I think we can move on so that we have a bit of time at the end for
Yeah, wonderful.
discussion.
Okay, so this is actually, I sort of designed it in three parts. So we have this third part is one where I sort of plug my book, but it's also, my book is sort of a compendium of things that I've picked up over the years that I found useful and effective. And this comes about because I'm not an educational researcher, at least I wasn't when I started. I've sort of become one, but when I started learning about this stuff, I wanted to not wade through a lot of literature, but just find what works. And so that's where this book came about because I'd been running a teaching and learning center. I had to learn pretty much from a standstill all the latest educational research, the scholarship of teaching and learning. And so I dived into it when I was in Singapore and kept going. So after about 6 years of swimming in the literature, this is kind of my very short, it's a short little book that condenses the results of that journey. Okay, so for those of you who are educational researchers, I'll apologize in advance because I do a quick review, but the idea is to get what's effective in a concise and easily accessed format. So one of the first tools, which many people know, the Bloom's taxonomy, right? You have different levels of learning, and you can actually see at the very bottom, two rungs there. This is the classic lecture, exam, test scenario. You might actually have a bunch of facts that you have to know. You might have to actually create a short research paper. And a lot of higher education is just jumping up and down off of the steps 1 and 2. But I think it's clear that with AI, steps 1 and 2 are covered with the AI. And in fact, maybe even the apply and analyze. You're really up there with the evaluate and create in the age of AI. And your students will try to get the AI to do all the other things. To some degree, it's successful, but in other cases, it's not. So really having the skills to evaluate become critical. And so I will allege that in the age of AI, we can outsource a lot of the lower three rungs to AI and then use our time with students and our class design to really work on these top three levels. There's another way of sort of thinking about all this, which is if you are taking a student-centered approach, as Carl Wieman advocates, you really have to think carefully about what they actually need to learn and not what you were taught when you were in the classroom. And then you also have to notice the enormous gap between what you put on a whiteboard and what they actually learn. So you really have to be realistic about what is actually sinking in. And then his last sort of component is what actually works. I also notice in my travels other ways of conceptualizing the learning enterprise. There are different pyramids besides Bloom's. This one I thought was kind of nice because it suggests a array of assessment activities that are based on active kinds of work. And this was actually done in a medical school context. So they would look carefully to see not only what they know, but how well they can put things into action. At MIT, I encountered this one, which is called the Feischl-Schmitz technical taxonomy, and it similarly goes through the set steps at the bottom, which are more or less capable of being done with AI, but then really comes into the top level of judgment. So I think one of the mottos for education in the AI era is education for judgment, which is also a title of a good book. The other thing that I found really useful is the idea of backward course design, where you really center your course design on the students. How will they change? How will I know if they got there? And what will students do? And I will underline and bold the do. What do our students actually do? Because the more they do, the more they learn. And this is how you get into active learning. Case studies, problem-based learning, peer learning exercise, those sort of things. Really center those activities because that's really where the students are going to learn, and that's really why you're teaching. Okay, backward course design is a well-established practice, but once you do it, you can actually find economies in your class where you can jettison large amounts of obsolete content. And I liken most university courses to something like DNA in organisms. As you may know, most organisms have a lot of DNA and only a tiny percentage of the DNA is actually being used for useful expression of characteristics, and a lot of it is a historical artifact from evolution. So I will contend that a lot of our courses are similarly artifacts from our evolution as a field. The other thing is, if we are looking at these higher order learning taxonomies, how do you actually work to foster this kind of higher order learning? And this is where, if I were in a place where we're all together, I'd have us really reflect on our own experience, both as students and teachers, of moments when we've had those sort of aha revelations of a higher order idea. How did those happen? And then use those to guide you in your course design. And oftentimes you'll find, I think, if you think about it, that these come from experiences more than anything. For me as a scientist, laboratory experiences, field trips are crucial. Okay, so if you want to do these kinds of activities, there are a lot of tools that work and have been widely tested and adopted. And so this is sort of a short uh, kind of primer on active learning. You want to have your active learning in a way that aligns with your course design. So this is where you want to think about backward course design and then embed in your syllabus not just content, but these activities. And then have in each class something like a script of what students are doing, maybe bookended with short, sort of 6-minute mini lectures, and using the scientific method to not only your field that you do research in, but to the idea that you as a teacher can actually get data and really study your students and think of them as a laboratory that you're testing your ideas. So Carl Wieman sort of brings it into this diagram here, where he imagines all these students are coming in with different levels of prior knowledge and different motivations. All of them share a very limited amount of disciplinary expertise, and all of them have the same brain constraints, with some variation. What you do is introduce to this group, this very differentiated group, situations where they practice their learning, that they do tasks and they are able to interact. And this is kind of a schematic of what active learning looks like. I'll add to it one other thing, which is the idea you can use a case study as one vehicle for getting students into this authentic context. I also really like the idea of a threshold concept. This is some idea that in your particular field, once you know it, you grasp a really crucial part of your field's deeper meaning. And so if you really think carefully about your field, you'll find a number of these really crucial ideas that you absolutely have to know. And once you know them, you sort of pass into a next level. That's where the threshold idea comes in. And there's a whole set of resources on this. At the bottom, I give a website that talks all about threshold concepts. The threshold concept idea arose out of a UK research project looking at British undergraduate education. They found that these threshold concepts are crucial for really creating more effective learning in their universities. So the idea of a threshold concept is that it will transform one once you know it. It produces irreversible learning, and then it will also connect to a lot of other things that will make it more relevant and useful to the student. And it often comes in your field from a very important paradigm shifts. So we can look at physics and find a lot of examples of these paradigm shifts. Obviously, the quantum revolution is one of them. Relativity is another. You can look at the Copernican revolution. All these revolutions are centered on ideas, and those ideas contain within them a big fraction of your entire subject, and you can use them as a simplifying and unifying concept in your class and focus on them to produce economies that will allow you to then have a richer classroom. Okay, so this is a little bit on the threshold concepts. I don't have a lot of time, but one way that they've been described is jewels in the curriculum. And that's just another way to think about them. Another thing I really like, which is not common in science, is the idea of a dialogue. And I think if you just stay with me for a bit, our friends in the humanities are very good at doing these Socratic kind of discussion sections. And we in sciences are less aware that this same process is important in our fields. In our case, though, we don't usually have our dialogue sitting around a seminar table. but in laboratories when we're doing experiments. And so if you think about what a good class is, you don't want to be in this upper left quadrant where you're telling students stuff that you know, but they already know it. That's actually useless for everyone. You can sometimes have in a classroom students that know things that they're telling others, and that's the basis of what we would call a jigsaw exercise. So that gives you a chance to have students teach each other and discover through discussion. And likewise, you can have from those discussions the emergence of unknown unknowns. And that's really magical when you can find from a discussion some unimagined connection or some other idea. And so I just encourage everyone to think about opportunities for bringing about those type of experiences. Anyway, to go on, active learning is key. It's the idea where students are actively, socially interacting, doing things in the classroom, and as Carl Wieman would say, developing expert thinking with feedback and practice. And I mentioned the study of the force concept inventory. This is from physics, the data from an early one of these papers in the 1990s. It's been extended, but you can see that in the active learning environments, they would be able to document a doubling in the learning of students that were in active learning environments. The idea that you want to keep in mind is that when you are doing your active learning, make sure that you do it in an experimental and scientific kind of way. Just document how your students are doing, and it'll dissuade you from having some of your doubts because it really does work. The other part that I really like to mention to people is the idea of peer instruction. And Eric Mazur is one of the pioneers, also in physics, but the idea of just stopping your class, allowing students to talk. So he provides a recipe where he would do this in large lecture classes. He would talk for about 10 minutes, get to a point where there was a challenging idea, and then it's this think, pair, share idea. Students would talk for a couple of minutes, they would talk to each other, and then they would have a way of polling them to see what answers came about, and they'd have a discussion about it. He's been doing this for years, and it's quite effective and can be done even without a lot of technology in the classroom. So this is the recipe that he provides, and I've put some of this in my book as well. The part that I like is this one, which comes into a flow chart where you talk, you provide a question, and then based on how many students get the answer right, you then loop back and reinforce the idea, or you move on. So it's also a great way to see if your students are really getting what you're saying and whether they're ready to move on. So this not only helps the students learn, but it helps provide feedback for you and make your class more effective. The other technique, which is very popular in Singapore, I found, and throughout Australia, is the idea of constructive alignment. And all this is really saying is that you need to get your different things that the students are doing, that's the lower right, what are they doing that arises from your course design, and have your teaching learning activities reinforcing all of it with a way of measuring it. So the Biggs and Tang who developed this have written all about the different ways of doing this and have provided a lot of really practical techniques for implementing this idea. But it's another way of thinking about active learning in the classroom. And with this technique, you can also refine your learning outcomes into different types that will move students into higher levels in the Bloom's taxonomy. I'm going to actually skip through a few slides here because I want to leave time at the end for questions. So I'll be sending these slides out and I will allow you to study them in detail. And it has a lot of different ways of implementing things. And I really like these ideas of recipes where you just either writing it down as a script or have in your mind the flow of a class is crucial. And you can kind of keep this as a sort of a script when you go into the classroom so that you can integrate your active learning exercises with your content in a way that assures progress through your syllabus, but also gives a sort of lively and constantly changing environment in a classroom. So this is one example of how you can structure a flipped classroom. But what I really like it is sort of illustrates the idea of planning your class in this kind of blocks of 10 to 15 minutes, and sometimes even 5 minutes. It'll really help the students because, again, their attention spans, especially now, are going to be 6 minutes or less. So you really need to have these blocks. Okay, so that's about all the slides I've got. I'm going to stop and thank everyone for a wonderful opportunity. And uh, I'm really happy to be sharing some of this stuff with you guys in Singapore. And I'll just stop and allow more questions.
Hey, thanks, Brian. I think we have a question, maybe two in the chat. I'm going to read some of them. Uh, so I think the first one from, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Nguyen Tan San, I think. I'm so sorry if I butchered that. Thank you. For the students in developing countries that are taught in traditional or even wrong methods of learning or scientific learning, what steps could they or their students take to shift their mindset to think more scientifically? I hope AI can analyze the process. So that's the first question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And thinking about your students in that way, where you're really accounting for where they're at, is so important. Just like, an army has to fight with the troops it has, the teacher has to teach with the students they have. And they may not be like you. They're, in fact, almost absolutely guaranteed to not be like you. They might have far less knowledge than you, but they come from a different generation often. And in some cases, they come from different educational experiences. So, in many cases, if you try to implement active learning pedagogies, it goes against the grain and the expectations of students. And so you have to be overt and explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and be gentle and bring it about in a sort of staged way where you'll have students, and I found the 1 minute exam is a good way. Short quizzes are an example that work really well. Just giving little bites of things that the students are doing and then gradually enable them to interact more with each other and interact more with you. And you'll begin to reconstruct some of their expectations of what a learning environment is. In terms of whether or not you can transport someone's disposition from either being scientific or not, I think that's a tough proposition because people, if they have a whole life where they're either not liking science or they reject science altogether, you need some kind of powerful demonstration of the value of science. And I guess for me, I found I teach astronomy, just taking people out to an observatory and looking through a telescope and having that magical experience of seeing Saturn's rings. I think that'll transform just about anyone into a fan of science. So finding ways of introducing experiences of that sort, and it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. You can bring in some organism in a biology class or make some really impressive demonstration in a chemistry class. But just making what your field represents real and bringing that into the classroom, I think, is crucial for enabling those students to come along with you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Brian. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more. I think we started maybe a couple of minutes late. Uh, I think it's kind of related. This is by Chiogi. Thank you. I'm curious, what forms of institutional support are most effective in facilitating educators' mind shifts, given that moving beyond traditional or current teaching practices can be difficult?
Wow. That's a great question too. And I'm writing a new book on higher education in the age of AI. And one of the chapters talks about basically I go through the top ranked universities in the world and see exactly how they're doing that. Of course, these are universities that tend to have lots of resources, but these are also universities where faculty are almost 100% concerned with their research. Generally, you have to incentivize the involvement in ways that either make sense to a faculty member in terms of saving time, or it makes sense to the faculty member in terms of enhancing or at least being aligned with research. And I think finding the finding the way of describing the complementarity of good teaching to good research is one important step. But then actually also providing incentives, which include, of course, financial incentives in the form of small grants. It includes the idea that teaching is valued by the institution. So having a highly visible, distinguished teaching series or a teach week, which a lot of these universities do, where you have open houses in classrooms and you just celebrate teaching as an institutional value. That's really important, maybe even more important than the money, is the idea that you can be prestigious in your research, yes, but there's also a component of prestige in being an excellent teacher. And leaders at universities can foster this, but even at a departmental level, just providing a little bit of time in department meetings to discuss interesting and effective moments in classrooms, or just sharing ideas and creating a community-oriented approach to teaching so people aren't isolated. Those kind of social arrangements, I think, are really perhaps even the most important. And it's actually paralleling the ideas of active learning that students learn when they have social interaction. But I think it's also true that faculty learn and they learn how to teach better when they're in this sort of social context.
Okay, so I am aware that it's slightly past 10, it's almost 10:35 here in Singapore. So I think I will like officially close the session. Please do the feedback form if you get a chance. I think my colleague has just dropped it in the chat. If you have to leave, if you would like to stay back and maybe ask one or two more questions. I'm also aware that it's quite late in the evening over in California. So I think for now, maybe I'll just take the time to thank Bryan in while everyone's still here for insightful talk. And if anyone has to go, you can go. If anyone has maybe a couple more questions, I hope Bryan, maybe one or two more you can take. Um, uh, yeah,
Yeah. And if
yeah.
I were in Singapore and it was dinner, I'd be going out to get some char kway teow. But unfortunately, I can't get that out here. So I'm going to go out and get some Thai food for dinner.
Yeah, char kway teow will be hard to get in California, I
It's hard to
imagine.
find. Yeah.
Uh,
We have good Vietnamese food in Southern California
we just heard
and
that
Thai food.
Chipotle is coming to Singapore, which I'm
Oh,
thrilled about.
wow.
Yeah, so
We
so that
have
might
uh,
be.
we have Din Tai Fung out here in Southern California, which I'm very excited about.
That's great. Yeah. Um, Actually, so if you have a couple more minutes, I have a
Sure.
one or two questions. So I think at some point you were talking about effective teaching, and I think one of the questions I have in my mind is whenever the concept of effective teaching comes up is like effective for what? And I think you mentioned Carl Wieman's idea of expert thinking. I wonder if you could just share a bit more about that. What exactly would you count as expert thinking? Because I really liked that idea and also the fluid intelligence thing. I wonder if there's a relation there.
Yeah, they're related but different. So that sort of idea of fluid versus crystallized intelligence came about from psychology research. And, one crystallized intelligence obviously is based on prior experience or prior knowledge. And liquid intelligence is the ability to quickly transfer and apply and recognize and respond. And so it's almost one's sort of a derivative, if you will, if you get the mathematics, and one's sort of a scalar position. So the idea of transporting yourself from one domain to another, one context to another, that's the liquid idea. The expert idea is a little bit deeper in that, yes, it is liquid to a point. It is that you can take your prior experience, but transport it into novel new contexts based on that experience. So in a way, the expert thinking idea is a blending of the two because it doesn't happen without experience, because the experience gives you a basis for providing judgment. And it doesn't mean that you're providing judgment based on ideas from earlier, but that process of finding discordant facts, finding disagreeing people or ideas, and reconciling them and finding the idea, That's a set of cognitive tools that is at the core of expert thinking. So it has a certain bit of crystallized knowledge, but at its core, it's the idea of judgment. It's the idea, the capacity to evaluate. And it is one of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. It's the idea of analyzing competing ideas. If I sort of flip back to the slides, if you look at sort of the top levels of Bloom's taxonomy, it's the idea of evaluation or judgment. And you can't evaluate or judge without prior experience. So integrating that prior experience with that kind of wisdom, that kind of experience. And this is the idea that, too, your crystallized knowledge is not just theoretical stuff, but actual things from real contexts. And that's the other thing he found that was really lacking in the curriculum is that there were a lot of very theoretical ideas that never really were useful in an actual laboratory or an actual current day physics. So expert thinking is not only the idea that you have past knowledge, but that the knowledge that you do have is relevant and current. I hope that answers.
Yeah, yeah, no, it does. I just want to open it up in case there's any other questions. I noticed there's a lot of people left in the room, so if there's anything, feel free to ask. I'm going to stop talking. And if there's nothing, we can just kind of close, I think, and we can reconnect separately. Brian, could I request you perhaps share your slides with us for
Of
dissemination?
course. Yeah, I planned on it. So that's why I put a lot of extra text in there that I couldn't read. But there are a lot of links in the slides and other things. So I'll send you off a PDF of all this great stuff. And I hope it's useful for people.
Thank you so much.